Welcome into a fresh Mental Game podcast. I'm Sam Brief here in the home studio in Chicago, and for today's episode, I'm going to take you to the cutting edge of the mental health and sports industry, and it's with Walt Norley, who's the founder and CEO of OnBalance, which is a really cutting edge mental health startup in sports where he partners with athletic programs, mostly college programs. His most notable client is Alabama, and he provides tech-based mental health support. So they've got algorithms, they've got scores and professionals that they use to help coaches make sure their athletes are mentally healthy. I know that's a lot. Walt will help explain, and we've got a link to their website in the description. But Walt goes way back with someone who first recruited him to play quarterback for The Ohio State University in the 1980s, and that is Nick Saban, who at the time was a Buckeye assistant coach, has just retired from Alabama as quite possibly the greatest college football coach of all time. So you'll get a lot of Nick Saban stories, a lot of insight on how Walt and how his company got here, and what might be next for mental health in athletics. So you'll enjoy this podcast with Walt Norley. And before I give it to you, just a quick reminder, friendly reminder, of course, that the Mental Game podcast is proudly sponsored by the Lasers Ladybug Society, a wonderful charity started up by John and Renee Laser down in Richmond, Virginia, that helps programs and schools both in that area and around the country with mental health support. They do this at a granular level, which means giving them $2 would help quite a bit. More than $2, help even more. We've got a link to their website in the description of this episode, so please consider clicking, reading about them, and maybe even supporting. Now, let's go to Walt Norley, latest guest on the Mental Game, coming in hot in 3, 2, 1. You and I know from following your business, listening to your podcast, are super like-minded in the way we approach this. So start by telling me, why is mental health near and dear to you?
I went through my own journey. I was diagnosed with bipolar when I was 25, and I'm a former college football player, played at a pretty high level, and I knew nothing about it. I had an episode, and when that was the diagnosis of what happened, I fought it. And I denied it, and I didn't accept it, and because of that, and because of the stigma, it was an internal. I mean, again, this is not today. That today this would be different, but yesteryear, I just didn't look at myself that way. I didn't accept the diagnosis, and I didn't accept the treatment, and because of that, I went through a lot, and over a 40-year journey, and I was very fortunate, and I say this over and over again, Sam, I'm very fortunate to be able to be here where I am and have had some relative success in my business career and, raising a family and so forth, having gone through that. So the importance to me of destigmatizing and putting this on par with physical ailments that people go through is, to me, it's an educational journey, and if you can educate people and get them to understand that it's not a weakness, it's no different than having an ACL tear or, diabetes or whatever, else could be physical, within an illness. And, because of that, you should go get treatment. At the end of the day, it's about, I didn't get treated properly because of me. Because I couldn't accept it. And so I went through, a yo-yo, peaks and valleys with it, and I'm in a good place, and because of that, I'm in a situation with my life and my career that I'm trying to do something about it, and that's to help other people.
It's amazing, Walt, and you alluded to some of the differences, right? 1980, you're playing college football versus 2024, we're reflecting on you playing college football, and as someone with bipolar disorder and looking around and seeing how back then it was stigmatized. Now, I wasn't in the trenches with you. I'm curious what that was like. Was mental health ever discussed? Was it alluded to in any way, shape, or form?
No. The quick answer to that, Sam, is no, because I don't think, get outside of sports, get outside of athletics. I don't, it was not topical, it was a under the rug, your aunt or your uncle or somebody had an issue. And even if it was in the family, it just wasn't discussed, and in general society, let alone athletics. And athletics is another level of mental strength, mental toughness. And so, somebody has an issue going on back then. It was, okay, that's interesting. Get back in the huddle, right, and get back on the field. And it's really a suck it up mentality. And you don't think about it. You didn't think about it. I'd never even heard this stuff, right? Back in, and just to be clear, I don't know if as a student athlete at Ohio State and Georgia, I have no idea whether I was going through anything. This diagnosis didn't happen until post college, but looking backwards, hindsight 2020, you have some thoughts of saying, well, I had surgeries my freshman year at Ohio State and then my junior year at Georgia. And, in the modern day, back then, anybody going through, that has high expectations and, is achievement oriented and competitive, when you're not playing and you're not performing and you're not, participating with your teammates and doing all the things that you expect of yourself and others expect of you, it has, it has you got to go, you have to process it, right? You have to process it. And back then there was no counselor to go talk to and therapist to go talk to. That wasn't even, it wasn't even in the playbook. So.
It wasn't even in the playbook, right? It wasn't part of the mental checklist you might go through. Like, you're a football player. You want to make sure your physical health is okay. You got to make sure your grades are in order to be academically eligible. Call mom, call dad. It seems like now part of that checklist is, am I mentally okay? Am I checking with the counselor? Programs now have that infrastructure. You couldn't even process what that was like back then. As someone who was struggling, what did it feel like to just have, go back on the field, go back on the gridiron, and you were also dealing with injuries as an added layer?
Candidly, because that was part of the mindset and the culture and the environment from the time I was, playing sports at age 8 all the way up, and I played every sport you can imagine for a long period of time. I don't know if there's self-consciousness back then, but you just did. You didn't talk about it with anybody. I mean, with anybody. If you felt self-doubt or insecure, or something really that wasn't going on, but you internalize it. You just the mentality in the culture back then, which is okay. That those things that you gain from that, Sam, also take you to another level in your life, right? I mean, these are lifetime things. And, one of the positives that happens within sports is that, that balance of pushing through, right? And that comes a little later. When you're young, you just do. And so to answer your question or thought process, I never thought about it. Did I feel certain things when I look back, 2020? Of course I did. But that was a day and age, whether it was your family or your friends or your teammates or your coaches or your teachers, your, school counselors, you didn't talk about that stuff. It just wasn't on the table.
It's so different now. And I know you're at the front lines of it with what you're doing with athletes on balance. Now, you've started businesses before, right? You've been in the business world post your college days at both Ohio State and Georgia. What was the inspiration behind this?
The pandemic was going on. I had sold a company. This is my 6th technology build, and
6 companies.
Yeah. So first started at 28, 29, but I've had failures. I've had my successes, and right now I'm above water. But I sold a company in 2019, and these things are hard. I mean, these are I call early stage tech companies, your years are measured in dog years, right? 1 year is 7. And so I was pretty tired. I took a break after I sold the company in 2019, and first time in my life, really. Not really, I was. And the pandemic came about, and I was getting people. I'm relatively with friends that I'm close with, relatively transparent of some of the stuff I've gone through, and I had people reaching out to me, kind of left and right, about a spouse or a daughter or son or a friend, going through struggles, right? And what do we do? And not that I was an expert, but they know my background, and that calls out the fact that if one of their loved ones, family or friends, were going through, a knee situation or a shoulder situation, they would have known exactly what to do because it's talked about. And I've talked to Tom, Sally, and Lou, and they said this orthopod is the best person for knees. And here we are in 2021, 22, and it's still taboo. And these are educated people, right? These are educated people that were successful in their lives, and even with that in mind, they had no idea what to do. And so it was a little bit of a light bulb moment when I said, you know what, I'm going to jump back into this thing. My life has been in the technology world, bringing data into what I'd call sunlight. Taking data not for the just sake of data collection, but for the purpose of insights and in particular performance metrics. So metrics management. I believe in the world of you can't manage what you can't measure, and so my previous businesses were all about taking information that industries did not have, and taking that and creating insights, and the insights moved to proactivity, and the proactivity produces better outcomes. So when I initially thought about this, and I start really kind of a white piece of paper and I conceptualize, then I kind of go to some industry experts, and I had a couple of people in the healthcare world that senior executive leadership people that I had been exposed to, and I kind of conceptualized and socialized it with them, and they said, you're on to something. And I quite frankly, I was fortuitous in what happened with athletics. Now, obviously I had 2 kids that played collegiate athletics, 2 daughters, and love sports, and saw all my kids play in these different sports through their younger lives. And I coached Nick Saban, and I go way back. He recruited me to Ohio State, and my mother had passed, and he did this beautiful video tribute. It was incredible. Myself and my family were very touched, and I called him to say, thank you. That was wonderful what you did, and you touched everybody. And I've known him since I was 18, and he said, he knows my background business well. He goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm thinking about playing around with something with mental health and performance metrics and data management. I said, is that something that's important to you? And he said, yeah, I was a psych major at Kent State. I did my master's in human behavior, and I've had, since I've become a head coach at Michigan State, I've always had a psychiatrist and psychologists involved. So he said, we have a great program down here. Come into Tuscaloosa, and I'll introduce you to Dr. Ginger Gilmore, who runs our behavioral medicine program. And I went in there, and lo and behold, we collaborated with Dr. Gilmore for developing what we've developed, and I think this is very relevant. Putting aside that program's great success on the football field and all the championships, and it's relevant. They are looked at as having, if not the best, certainly one of the best programs in the NCAA by Dr. Brian Hanline, who's the chief medical officer for the NCAA at Alabama. So we had a chance to go in and work with kind of best in industry to develop something special, and that's what we're doing today.
What was the biggest roadblock in developing that? It sounds like Nick Saban getting involved, and I know you two go back to him recruiting you With this is, let's see,
40 years.
40 years ago, right? Now he's retired from coaching. So I'm thinking about young Saban recruiting you, later on helping you out. But in building a platform in mental health, which is becoming a more crowded space, I'm curious the biggest roadblock.
That's a good question. There wasn't a roadblock, Sam. We've moved very quickly on this. I mean, compared to my other builds, because of the collaboration with Dr. Gilmore and her knowledge. And so what we have is we have a software platform that's very comprehensive. We call Care in One Place. And there's a part of our pillar of the platform. So it's really a electric medical record program database built specifically for athletics and specifically collegiate athletics. And we did that well. And that's the source of our data, right? So you have to grab your data somewhere. So think about going to a doctor's appointment and they put your stuff in. The uniqueness that we developed on our own was a scoring program. And look at everybody in athletics loves scores, right? And I've done this before in previous history where you're essentially creating a numerical system that didn't exist before, and I'm trying to always find examples, when I talk about this, which is, at some point in time, nobody knew what 72 degrees was. How do you feel, right? I feel it's comfortable right now. It's cold. Well, somebody developed a numerical system that paralleled, with, how it felt, cold, average. And so that's a lot of what I've done, and in a lot of cases, if you can figure out what's a norm, on a data set, then you can start figuring out excellent, good, and below, right? So we set up a scoring program as the foundation of this. And it's all about reliability, and it's really severity levels, mental health well. So, severe, moderate, mild, well, that's pretty broad, right? That's a pretty big bucket. So what we've done with, science and with the psychiatric, community and consultants in particular, we came in and put levels of severity within those three buckets. So levels of severe, levels of moderate, levels of mild. And so because they matter, somebody saying severe, like, well, how severe, right? You're hospitalized severe, or, you're okay to, to function at some degree. Do we have to somebody, watch you and handhold you? So we developed the scoring system as the foundation. And, from a barrier standpoint, we, we're still very early stage. And I think if you ask me that question in 6 months, I might have a better answer for you, because we haven't hit a wall yet. The only thing I'd say to you, and when you come in and do something missionary, and we're doing something missionary, it's never been done. And I'll tell you what the definition of that is. It means that nobody knows they need it, and they don't know they need it in their budget. Right. So explain to me. So the challenge, and it's a major challenge, is you have to go prove it. You have to go quantify that. So that's why you have in Alabama and, some of the other schools that we're bringing in right now that I can't publicly talk about. And, it's all about those, what I'd call the early adopters, the innovators of this industry, athletic directors, coaches, mental health experts, that believe that technology will improve mental health care. And when you get that first 4, 5, 6 of those, innovators that get quantifiable, outcomes, that creates the market, right? So you essentially get your early group, they create the market, and then everybody else says, wow, did you see what happened there? In this business, this is athletic business in college sports. And let's be honest, whether, it's somebody's knee that went out or their shoulder that went out, it's about getting them back in competition, right? It's getting them back in the pool or the court or the field. And it's the same thing with mental health. So the quicker you can get an outcome to get somebody healthy and reduce the cases, right? So preventative medicine. So if you have data that leads to, then we're bringing AI into all this. So you take that data and you get trends, right? And trends move into predictions, and predictions move into prevention. So when you have that kind of intelligence, you know, our desire here is to, you know, minimize the amount of illness cases that you have within an athletic department, and get them back into competition.
You mentioned your early adopters, and publicly we know one of them's Alabama, right? And you've worked with Nick Saban for decades now. Take me behind the curtain a little bit. What's Nick's approach to mental health?
Well, you know, I don't want to overstate, you know, that knowledge base. You know, I've been doing my things for a long time, and he's obviously been doing what he's doing very successfully. So our interface, specifically to this, has been, you know, relatively recent. But look, I have to tell you, I didn't know this. I did not know how knowledgeable that he is. I mean, when I've spoken to him about this, his grasp of, you know, he takes it. I know he can go deep with mental health and specific disorders and how it has to be managed and how you have to treat it, and you have to have the resources to treat it, which is the people with the expertise. But he also understands, you know, which is why he's been so successful and the programs have been successful. He understands that intersection. You know, you can't separate the mind from the body. You know, to be simple, and he, you know, a lot of people say, but he says it, and he believes it, and because he believes it, um, the people that play for him, including the coaches, including the trainers, and including everybody in that ecosystem, you know, it's accepted that it's okay to go get help, right? And that's a big thing. You know, the stigma and the judgment with, you know, elite athletes at the Alabama level that were, you know, blue chip, you know, 4-star, 5-star kids that kind of gone anywhere. And, you know, we all know about, you know, the NFL first round success they've had. Um, a lot of that's tied to his mentality and making it acceptable within his organization, right? That this is part of our business. You know, the mind and the mental health and the behavioral activities and people being accountable is part of going to be our success, and we're not going to ignore that, and we're going to tie that together as we develop them as football players. And you know, and I know this for a fact, and I think this is extraordinary as well. And he has said it to me, and you know, I'm sure he said it publicly. He develops people. You know, he develops people for not just football in the NFL. You know, there's lifelong elements that he and his process and his mentality are helping, you know, these young men in their journey when they get into their 20s, 30s, 40s, et cetera, right?
Right. You're telling me he understands it. I feel like there's a lot of talking about it nowadays, right? Back then it was never talked about, right?
Right.
Totally taboo. Mental health is barely a thing. We'll only talk about go on the field, go on the field.
Right.
Now we're coming into an era of more understanding and a lot of talking, a lot of, oh, I prioritize mental health. Oh, I'm mental health forward. I embrace mental health. It's okay to not be okay. I hear a lot of that, which is great.
Right.
But it's a little more rare to find a coach or find someone in the sports industry who doesn't just say those things, but actually gets it. Feels like Saban's like that.
He is, and I think his disciples. I had a conversation today on our podcast with Michael Loxley, the head coach at Maryland, who was with Nick when they went. Well, 2017, they went to 3 national championships and won it in 17. And you know, he went through a tragedy with his son, unfortunately with mental illness, and then unfortunately, you know, passing. But he talked about that, so that, you know, he actually brought, you know, really, he said, I didn't know anything about mental health until I was at Alabama and I got exposed to it because of Coach Saban's philosophies. And then, you know, simultaneous, unfortunately, I lost my son and I had to get educated. And now he has that as part of his program. And from what I understand this, and I don't know this deeply, but evidently, you know, his, you know, all his disciples that are head coaches have taken elements of that, into their own programs. So, again, it works, right? What he has proven at the highest level is that when you take that seriously and you're not judgmental, and there's that balance in anything, life, in your world, in my world, and that balance between, should I push through it, or should I go get treatment, right? Do I need help, right? And that's part of the education. That's a part of our education for us, right? In our journeys. And success with athletes, and non-athletes is knowing how, mental tough, and mental is thinking and being intelligent, and to think and to be intelligent, you have to have knowledge, right? And so, when somebody comes in at age 17, 18 years old to go play at an Alabama or Maryland or Miami or any of these, big programs, you have to be educated. When somebody has a knee issue, they got exposed to a knee issue when they were 15, playing a sport. They got a pitcher or a quarterback got exposed to rotator stuff, when they were 16, 17, 18 years old, right? That's an accepted, subject, right? And it's part of performance, and it's part of injury. Well, the mental side, nobody comes in, to a program and knows anything about that. So having a program in place that educates that person, that young athlete, on what can go on with depression and anxiety and substance abuse and panic attacks and, suicidal ideations, eating disorders, et cetera. That's just a world they never had. So think about the power of all of a sudden being educated to that and understanding there's resources around you if perhaps you go through, part of that journey.
Right. It's the power of language, the power of understanding. I was just reading, I think you'll vibe with this, Walt. Jeremy Schaap wrote a book called Triumph about Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. And like you, former Ohio State student athlete. Right. And Jesse, in the lead up to those Berlin Olympics, he was getting burnt out. And he actually had a kid back at home in Cleveland that he was concerned about, and he was having issues at school and issues with his training, and there was a lot of drama behind the scenes about whether the U.S. was even going to go to Berlin, and all this stuff was combining and running him down, and he was mentally exhausted and struggling. But in reading that, there just wasn't a language to describe that he was mentally stressed and running poorly as a result. They were saying, oh, he must be injured, he must be tired, he must be lazy, coming up with all these excuses, right, when it was a mental health issue due to the stress of the situation around him. I just think back on moments like that. If we had a language back then for mental health, how much would that help those athletes? Because now, today's athletes, they do get that.
Yeah, it's tied to performance, right? I mean,
right.
If you're not okay upstairs and you don't feel good about things, and you're fatigued, and you don't know what to do about it, if again, to make that parallel, if it was your knee and your legs and they're just tired, they're worn out, we know what to do. You go get treatment, right? You get them up, you get them iced, you take the inflammation down, and deep tissue, etc. And the mind's the same way, right? The mind, if you're going to go out there and do all the things you're supposed to do on the court or the field or the pool, as physically fit and ready for performance as you need to be, with all the knowledge modern day, my gosh, I mean, the data that they have for getting to peak performance, right? With rest, with hydration, when to train, when not to train. I mean, it's a scientific approach that is just enhanced, the athlete's performance dramatically. It's the same thing with the mind. It's one and the same. I mean, if you're in great condition and your legs are great and your arms great, but your head's not there and you're struggling, you just the chances of you going out there and performing at your peak potential are probably pretty low.
Walt, I talk to a lot of smart people on this podcast, And you're clearly one of them. I love your ideas. I love your company. I love your vision. So I want to end this with a similar question to how I end most of these podcasts. Give my audience a piece of advice.
I think that to normalize this and eliminate, I mean, you drive, my world of data is driving to outcome. So my advice is that as a society, which obviously, transitions into the athletic world, general population and otherwise, talk about it no different. I use the example, Sam, of two friends who haven't seen each other for some time. They sit down, they're going to have lunch and say, how are you? Well, I just are you playing tennis now? I just had a meniscus, surgery and, haven't been able to play, but I'm going to be, I had to take care of a little scope and I'll be back on the courts and, probably in 30 days. How you doing? I'm okay. I went through a little bit of a depression cycle, and but the good news, I found a good doctor and got me on the right medication, and I'm feeling great. Boom. Okay. How the kids? How's work going? In other words, that's a normal discussion, right? It's to be able to normalize this subject and not treat it like it's taboo, because when let's be honest, when somebody has surgery in the hospital for a knee or a shoulder or back or whatever it may be, they get flowers. Wouldn't it be nice at one point in time that, somebody gets hospitalized for this and, they're getting cards and they're getting flowers saying, get well soon, right? So my advice is that with your family, your friends, you talk about, I don't think you have to over talk it. It's my meniscus thing. You don't sit there and talk about your knee, for an hour, right? And bore the bejesus out of somebody. You make the statement and you ask how they're doing. And I and in order to do that, everybody needs to be safe. They have to feel safe, that they're going to share that they've had an issue here as opposed to here, and they're not going to be judged. So more conversation, more people like you that are out here, bringing this to light and awareness and education. What you're doing on the athletic side, Sam, where athletes are, they're idolized in a lot of situations, right? And they're looked at as super beings, big, strong, infallible. And as you well know, that's not true. And so, you bringing athletes and people from this world into this subject line, and they're, honestly talking about, I think it helps everybody else. I don't think it just helps athletes. I think it helps everybody.
Let's keep pushing it forward. Walt, thank you for joining.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I appreciate being involved.
And back here in the studio, big thanks to Walt Norley for an awesome episode. It's cool to hear about the cutting edge, right? What is happening now at the startup level in sports, because the major programs that we see used in sports, and I'm talking systems, right? Those all start as little seeds, right? And that's what OnBalance is as a company. Of course, they've got a major client in Alabama, so I'm excited to see what's coming up next. And speaking of Alabama, some of those stories about Nick Saban, and really the idea that Nick, as a coach, was more knowledgeable about mental health than just about anyone in the country, it makes me think of two words: rat poison. It was a couple years ago. Alabama, of course, was number one in the country, and they were getting gassed up in the media. They're great. They're amazing. They're going to win it all. Another championship. And Nick Saban said all this media attention is like rat poison for my program, for my guys. And everyone in the media was like, oh, what's this guy off his rocker? People were memeing it on social media, laughing about the rat poison. But in hindsight, I look at that quote and I say, okay, Nick Saban was locked in on the mental health and the mentality of his players. It wasn't just about schemes. It wasn't just about bodies and X's and O's. It was about their minds. And that next level thinking is why Alabama won so many games. And as we heard from Walt, and as we have heard from Nick Saban, he does his best to keep his players not just physically healthy, but mentally healthy and mentally in tune. That's why he's the greatest of all time. So thank you to Walt for a wonderful podcast, and thank you to you for listening. As always, please rate, subscribe, review the episode. All those little metrics help quite a bit. This has been The Mental Game. I'm Sam Brief. A joy to be with you. Make sure you take care of yourself and of others, and I'll talk to you next time. That's a wrap from The Mental Game.